What if I told you that Ted Turner owns ranches so expensive they make billionaire estates look like starter homes? We're talking about properties worth hundreds of millions of dollars each, spanning landscapes larger than entire states and hiding conservation secrets that will absolutely blow your mind. Number 10. Spikebox Ranch, Nebraska, $85 million. In the heart of Nebraska's sandhills lies a 62,000-acre treasure that represents one of the most controversial land purchases in modern ranching history. When Turner acquired the Spikebox Ranch in 2002, local cattlemen were furious. Here was a billionaire outsider buying prime Nebraska grassland and announcing he was going to run bison instead of cattle, something that hadn't been done in this region for over 150 years. The Nebraska sandhills are unlike anywhere else on Earth. 20,000 square miles of grass-stabilized sand dunes that were formed by ancient winds. This landscape is so fragile that one wrong move can create a blowout that takes decades to heal. Local ranchers had spent generations learning how to graze cattle on this delicate ecosystem without destroying it. Turner's decision to introduce bison was seen as reckless experimentation with land that feeds America. But Turner had done his homework. He knew that bison had evolved on these exact grasslands for thousands of years, and their grazing patterns were perfectly suited to the sandhills' unique ecology. The controversy intensified when Turner removed all the existing cattle and infrastructure, essentially erasing a century of ranching tradition overnight. Local newspapers ran editorials questioning whether a media mogul from Atlanta understood Nebraska agriculture. But within 5 years, something remarkable happened. The native grass species that had been suppressed by cattle grazing began to return. Rare birds that hadn't been seen in the area for decades started nesting again. Turner's experiment was working, and even his harshest critics had to admit the land was healthier than it had been in living memory. Number 9. Z-Bar Ranch, Kansas, $95 million. The 16,000-acre Z-Bar Ranch sits in the Kansas Flint Hills, the last remnant of a grassland ecosystem that once covered 170 million acres of North America. When Turner purchased this property, he wasn't just buying a ranch, he was acquiring one of the rarest ecosystems on the planet. Less than 4% of the original tall grass prairie remains, making every acre incredibly precious. But Turner's management of the Z-Bar Ranch sparked a fierce debate about fire that continues today. The tall grass prairie evolved with fire, and Turner insisted on using controlled burns to maintain the ecosystem, a practice that terrified neighboring ranchers who had spent their lives fighting prairie fires. The first time Turner's crew conducted a prescribed burn, local fire departments were put on high alert, and neighbors watched nervously as smoke billowed across the Flint Hills. Many thought Turner was playing with forces he didn't understand. Prairie fires had destroyed countless homesteads and killed livestock throughout Kansas history. But Turner had studied the science. He knew that without fire, the prairie would be invaded by trees and shrubs, destroying the grassland ecosystem that had sustained bison herds for millennia. The burns had to be conducted under precise weather conditions, specific wind speeds, humidity levels, and temperatures that created a narrow window of opportunity. One mistake could create an uncontrolled wildfire that would devastate the region. Turner's fire management program now serves as a model for prairie restoration across the Great Plains. But it took years of careful execution to prove that controlled burning could be done safely on this scale. Number 8. Snowcrest Ranch, Montana, $110 million. High in Montana's Centennial Valley, the 110,000-acre Snowcrest Ranch sits at 6,800 feet elevation, surrounded by peaks that rise over 10,000 feet. This is grizzly bear country, and Turner's decision to restore this property to its natural state meant inviting back predators that most ranchers spend their lives trying to keep away. When Turner acquired Snowcrest, it had been heavily grazed by cattle for over a century. The previous owners had run as many cattle as the land could support, and then some. Overgrazing had created erosion problems, degraded the native vegetation, and reduced wildlife populations to a fraction of their historic levels. Turner's first decision shocked the local ranching community. He removed every single cow from the property and announced he was going to let nature take its course. Neighbors predicted disaster. Without grazing pressure to keep the vegetation short, they argued the ranch would become a fire hazard and a breeding ground for predators that would threaten livestock on surrounding properties. The controversy intensified when wolves began returning to the area. These weren't Turner's wolves. They were wild animals moving down from Yellowstone, attracted by the recovering elk and deer populations on Snowcrest. Local ranchers demanded that Turner control the predators, but he refused. His philosophy was that a healthy ecosystem needed all its original components, including top predators. The tension came to a head when wolves from the Snowcrest area killed cattle on neighboring ranches. Turner faced lawsuits and death threats from angry ranchers who blamed him for the predator problems. But he stood his ground, and over time, the ecosystem began to balance itself. Predator and prey populations stabilized, and the land showed remarkable recovery. Number 7. Red Rock Ranch, New Mexico. $125 million. Turner's 358,000-acre Red Rock Ranch in northern New Mexico became the center of one of the most ambitious and controversial species recovery programs in American history. This property spans multiple life zones, from desert grasslands at 5,000 feet to alpine meadows above 10,000 feet, creating habitat diversity that Turner believed could support species that had been extinct in the wild for decades. The controversy began when Turner announced he was going to breed Mexican gray wolves on the ranch. These wolves had been extinct in the wild since the 1970s, with only a handful surviving in captivity. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had been trying to breed enough wolves for reintroduction, but the program was plagued by problems. Genetic bottlenecks, disease outbreaks, and high mortality rates had kept the captive population dangerously small. Turner offered to help, but his involvement sparked fierce opposition from neighboring ranchers who feared that wolves bred on his property would eventually be released into the wild, threatening their livestock. The breeding program faced one crisis after another. Disease wiped out entire litters, and genetic problems threatened the bloodline. Turner had already invested millions of dollars with little to show for it. Critics argued that he was wasting money on a species that was doomed to extinction. Environmental groups worried that private breeding programs might compromise the scientific integrity of species recovery efforts. But Turner persisted, working with wildlife biologists to overcome each obstacle. The breakthrough came in 2008, when the first healthy wolf pups in decades were born on the ranch. Today, wolves bred at Red Rock Ranch have been successfully released into the wild, playing a crucial role in the species recovery. Number 6. Armendaris Ranch, New Mexico. $140 million. The 358,000-acre Armendaris Ranch in south-central New Mexico sits in the Chihuahuan Desert, a landscape that receives less than 12 inches of rain per year and was considered worthless by most people. When Turner acquired the ranch, local real estate agents couldn't believe he was willing to pay premium prices for what they called wasteland. The property had been severely damaged by decades of overgrazing. Cattle had eaten the native vegetation down to bare dirt, creating erosion problems that scarred the landscape. Invasive species had taken over areas where native plants once thrived. Most experts believed the damage was irreversible, that the desert ecosystem had been pushed beyond its ability to recover. Turner's restoration of Armendaris required techniques that had never been tried on this scale in desert environments. He had to rebuild soil that had blown away, re-establish native plant communities that had been destroyed, and create water sources in a landscape where rainfall was unpredictable. The work was backbreaking and expensive. Crews had to hand plant thousands of acres with native seeds, build erosion control structures, and construct over 200 water developments to support wildlife in the arid environment. Many of the techniques failed initially, requiring constant experimentation and adaptation. Critics argued that Turner was throwing money at an impossible task, that you couldn't restore a desert ecosystem that had been damaged for over a century. But Turner's team persisted, learning from each failure and gradually developing methods that worked. Today, Armendariz supports over 300 species of birds and has become a model for desert restoration projects across the Southwest. Number 5. Ladder Ranch, New Mexico. $160 million. The 156,000-acre Ladder Ranch in southwestern New Mexico became the unlikely home for one of the most unusual conservation programs in North America. Turner's effort to save the Bolson tortoise from extinction, these ancient reptiles which can live over 100 years and weigh up to 100 pounds, were down to fewer than 2,500 individuals when Turner began his breeding program. The challenge seemed impossible. Bolson tortoises take 15 to 20 years to reach sexual maturity, and females only lay eggs every few years. Most experts said there simply wasn't enough time to save the species, that by the time a breeding program could produce results, the wild population would be extinct. Turner's decision to attempt captive breeding was controversial within the scientific community. Some researchers argued that resources would be better spent protecting the tortoise's remaining habitat in Mexico rather than trying to breed them in captivity. Others worried that captive-bred animals might lose the genetic diversity and behavioral traits needed to survive in the wild. The breeding program faced constant setbacks. Eggs failed to hatch, juveniles died from disease, and adult tortoises proved difficult to breed in captivity. Turner invested millions of dollars in specialized facilities, hired expert herpetologists, and partnered with zoos and universities. But progress was painfully slow. For years, critics pointed to the program as an example of wealthy dilettantism, a rich man's hobby that was unlikely to produce meaningful conservation results. But Turner's patience and persistence eventually paid off. The Ladder Ranch now maintains one of the largest captive populations of Bolson tortoises in the world, and the breeding program has produced hundreds of offspring that may eventually be released to bolster wild populations. Number 4. Bad River Ranch, South Dakota. $180 million. Turner's 133,000-acre Bad River Ranch in south-central South Dakota sits in the heart of what was once the largest grassland ecosystem in North America. When he acquired the property, it represented everything that was wrong with American agriculture: native prairie converted to cropland, wildlife populations decimated, and soil degraded by decades of intensive farming. The ranch had been farmed for over a century, with most of the native vegetation plowed up and replaced with corn and soybeans. The conversion had been an ecological disaster. Millions of tons of topsoil had blown away during dust storms, wetlands had been drained, and wildlife populations had collapsed. Turner's decision to restore the property to native grassland was seen as economic madness by local farmers who couldn't understand why anyone would take productive cropland out of agriculture. The restoration required techniques that had never been attempted on this scale. Turner had to stop all farming operations, remove miles of drainage tiles, and replant thousands of acres with native grass species that hadn't grown on the land for generations. The work was complicated by the fact that many of the original plant species were no longer available commercially. Turner's crews had to collect seeds from remnant prairies hundreds of miles away. The first attempts at restoration failed spectacularly. Planted seeds didn't germinate, invasive weeds took over prepared areas, and erosion problems got worse before they got better. Local farmers predicted that Turner would give up and return the land to agriculture within a few years. But Turner persisted, learning from each failure and gradually developing restoration techniques that worked. Today, Bad River Ranch supports over 3,500 bison and has become a model for large-scale grassland restoration across the Great Plains. Number 3. Vermejo Park Ranch, New Mexico, $200 million. Spanning 580,000 acres across the Sangre de Cristo Mountains of northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. Vermejo Park Ranch is larger than the state of Rhode Island and represents Turner's most ambitious high-altitude conservation project. The property includes 21 peaks over 10,000 feet and encompasses ecosystems ranging from desert grasslands to alpine tundra. When Turner acquired Vermejo Park, it came with a complicated history that included mining claims, timber rights, and grazing leases that had been in place for over a century. Untangling these competing interests required years of legal work and millions of dollars in buyouts. Many of the previous land uses had damaged the property's ecological integrity. Mining operations had left scars on the landscape, logging had removed old-growth forests, and overgrazing had degraded native vegetation. Turner's restoration efforts faced opposition from multiple directions. Local communities worried about losing jobs in mining and logging. Hunters feared that Turner's management would reduce game populations. Environmental groups questioned whether private ownership was the best way to protect such a large and ecologically important landscape. The restoration work itself was enormously challenging. At high altitudes, the growing season is short and weather conditions are harsh. Restoration projects that might take a few years at lower elevations could take decades in alpine environments. Turner had to develop specialized techniques for high-altitude restoration, working with researchers from universities across the country. The investment was enormous. Turner spent over $50 million on habitat improvements alone, but the results have been spectacular. Wildlife populations have increased dramatically, and the property now supports some of the finest big game hunting in North America. Number 2, Flying D Ranch, Montana, $250 million. The 113,000-acre Flying D Ranch in southwestern Montana holds a special place in Turner's empire because it was his first major ranch acquisition and the place where he proved that large-scale bison restoration could work. Located in the Gallatin Valley near Bozeman, this property became the testing ground for ideas that would later be applied across Turner's entire ranch empire. When Turner acquired Flying D in 1989, it was a degraded cattle ranch that had been overgrazed for decades. The native vegetation had been replaced by weeds, erosion had scarred the landscape, and wildlife populations were at historic lows. Turner's announcement that he was going to remove all cattle and replace them with bison created a firestorm of controversy in the Gallatin's Valley. Local ranchers were outraged that an outsider was abandoning proven ranching practices for what they saw as a romantic fantasy about the Old West. The Montana Stock Growers Association publicly criticized Turner's plans, arguing that bison were unpredictable and dangerous animals that had no place in modern agriculture. Neighbors worried that bison would break through fences and damage their property. State officials questioned whether Turner had the expertise to manage large numbers of bison safely. The first bison introduction was a tense affair, with local media covering the event and neighbors watching nervously from fence lines. When the gates opened and the bison ran across the prairie for the first time in over a century, even Turner's critics had to admit it was an emotional moment. But the real test came over the following years, as Turner's team learned how to manage bison on a large scale. There were escapes, injuries, and equipment failures that provided ammunition for critics who said the experiment was doomed to fail. Turner persisted through each crisis, gradually developing management techniques that worked. Today, Flying D supports over 5,000 bison and has become a model for bison restoration across the American West. Number 1. Ventura Ranch, Wyoming, $300 million. At the pinnacle of Turner's ranch empire sits the spectacular 107,000-acre Ventura Ranch in northwestern Wyoming, a property so ecologically important and expensive that it represents the ultimate achievement in American conservation. Located adjacent to Grand Teton National Park and the National Elk Refuge, this ranch encompasses some of the most pristine wilderness remaining in the lower 48 states. The acquisition of Ventura Ranch was Turner's most complex and expensive land purchase, involving years of negotiations and multiple competing interests. The property had been owned by the same family for generations, and selling it to Turner required overcoming deep emotional attachments to the land. Local conservationists worried that private ownership might compromise public access to critical wildlife habitat. Hunters feared that Turner's management might reduce hunting opportunities. The Wyoming congressional delegation questioned whether such an important property should be in private hands. Turner's purchase price of $300 million was the highest ever paid for a ranch in American history, sparking debates about whether wealthy individuals should be able to control such vast landscapes. The property's location made it incredibly valuable, but also incredibly controversial. It serves as a critical wildlife corridor connecting Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks, providing essential winter habitat for the Jackson Hole elk herd, one of the largest in North America. Any changes to the ranch's management could affect wildlife populations throughout the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Turner's stewardship of Ventura has been exemplary, but the property remains controversial because of its importance to regional wildlife populations and its role in the broader debate about public versus private land ownership in the American West. The ranch generates over $20 million annually through hunting and fishing programs that attract wealthy clients from around the world, proving that conservation can be extremely profitable when done at the highest level. The economic empire behind the conservation. What most people don't realize is that Turner's ranch empire generates over $200 million annually, making it one of the most successful conservation businesses in history. This isn't just about preserving land. It's about proving that conservation can be more profitable than traditional agriculture or development. The hunting programs alone generate over $100 million annually, with premium experiences commanding prices that reflect their exclusivity and quality. Turner's bison operations have created an entirely new market for grass-fed, free-range meat. His Ted's Montana Grill restaurant chain has served over 50 million bison meals, creating demand that supports not just Turner's ranches, but bison producers across the country. The success of this venture has proven that Americans are willing to pay premium prices for meat that's produced sustainably and humanely. The economic impact extends far beyond Turner's properties. His ranches employ thousands of people in rural communities across the American West, providing good-paying jobs in areas where economic opportunities are often limited. Local suppliers, contractors, and service providers benefit from the millions of dollars Turner spends annually on ranch operations and improvements. Ted Turner's ranch empire proves that conservation and capitalism can work together to create something truly extraordinary. From $85 million prairie preserves to $300 million wilderness sanctuaries, these properties represent the future of American land stewardship. If you want to see more incredible stories about America's most valuable properties, make sure to subscribe and check out the next video on your screen about another conservation success story that will inspire you.